The Australian population is growing. Is that a good thing?
Well, but before I get to that, look, the population growing is good because it means more people to watch Sky News, which is good for the ratings. It's ultimately good for my pay packet. But if you stick around towards the end of the show, when we talk about the kids wanting to go to jail for Christmas, you might get a musical rendition from Liz. I'm not promising it, but I'm saying stick around because you might get one. But migration, onto more serious topics. The numbers we've seen this week show that we've had already this year some 500,000 people pour into the country. Now, of course, during COVID, we had a time when, of course, no one was coming into the country. We had no foreign students, we had no migrants coming. So the federal government has decided essentially to make up for all of that very quickly since they came to power last year. Now, we know that we are in the grips, of course, of a cost of living crisis, and we're also in the grips of large inflation. Now, next Tuesday, Melbourne Cup Day, the RBA will be weighing up whether or not they increase interest rates. And one of the major drivers of increased interest rates, of course, is the fact that against all predictions, the price of housing continues to go up. It doesn't take an economist to tell you that if you bring in 500,000 extra people, when you already have a supply and demand problem, the supply and demand problem is only going to get worse. And when supply and demand gets worse, then you end up with inflation. I mean, who would have thought that this would happen if you just bring people en masse into the country? I know, it is shocking. The former Reserve Bank Governor, Philip Lowe, before he departed the job, told us that immigration was increasing about 2.5% and the housing stock was increasing by 1.3%. We're not even making up half of what we need. Pauline Hanson talked to Rita Panahi on Credlin about this a little earlier.
When I spoke about immigration into the country, you've got to do it in a well-managed, balanced way so we have the infrastructure in place to deal with it. Governments and politicians have lost touch with grassroots Australians who are struggling to own their own home. You've got 100 that line up. If a rental accommodation comes up for rent, that's about 100 people lining up for it. You've got the price of houses. Banks are making more money out of it because they're loaning more loans to, higher loans to people. You've got state governments, they're reaping all the benefits from the stamp duty. This is benefits to governments and to big business, but it's not helping the Australian people, their way of life, their standard of living, and governments keep doing it.
Now, of course, we've had all these empty promises. Oh, we're going to build 1,250,000 new homes or some nonsense. God knows how they think they're going to do that when builders keep falling over, because the cost of building a house, of course, has gone up as well. And they've sold all these fixed price contracts that no one can now honour because it's costing them too much money. At what point do we say this just is not working? And I know I've made this argument before. It's like a dog chasing its own tail. We say we don't have enough people to fill all the jobs we've got here, so we've got to bring more people into the country. So we bring more people into the country, which then creates more jobs, which then means we've got to bring in more people to fill those jobs, and on and on and on and on it goes. We're diddling ourselves something chronic.
Yeah, and I mean, the housing crisis is only getting worse and the government are making it so, which is why whenever Jim Chalmers speaks, have you noticed he only speaks about everything happening overseas for which he has no control. He talks about Ukraine, he talks about now the Middle East, he talks about climate change, but he doesn't talk about the one thing they could control here, which is immigration. You've got rental vacancies at 1.1%. Nationally. Incredible. You've got Judith Sloan writing in The Australian today saying most families would have to save for 10 years just to afford a housing deposit. So things are pretty grim if you're looking to own a property. And in the midst of that, the government are bringing in record numbers of migrants. So none of it makes sense. And for the government to continue to say, oh, it's things happening beyond our control is just not true.
100%. And I think given the current temperature and what's going on in our world today and what we're seeing unfold in streets across the West, it's not just the practicalities of these numbers flooding into our country when they can't even look after our own, thanks for nothing, government. it's also the question of, is anyone allowed to ask, where are these people coming from? Do they share our values? Are they here to assimilate? Do they appreciate our culture? Do they actually want to be a part of Australia and the Australian way of life? And it was this point that former PM Johnny Howard spoke to with GB News in the UK recently.
I believe that when you migrate to another country, you should, as far as reasonably, be expected to absorb the mainstream culture of that country. Sure, retain your affection. It largely works well, I think, because people are attracted to the foundation mainstream culture of Australia, which is open and tolerant, but also very proud of what our country has achieved. And I think if we put more emphasis on what our nation has achieved and what the Western world has achieved, and we're less apologetic and less inclined to say, oh, we're all to blame, the better we would be.
Well said, Johnny Howard, because this is an issue that we're seeing across the West, especially in the UK, especially in Europe. They're years ahead of us. And many of those countries, I think, are lost forever in terms of what they once were. They will never be again due to the ginormous influx of migrants, many of whom aren't fans of the West and make no secret about it. But that ship has now sailed, and there's very little they can do about it. Not only the legal migrants we're talking about, but the tens of thousands of illegal migrants, especially in London, costing taxpayers millions of pounds a day to house them in luxury hotels. This seems to be a real issue, and yet Australia seems absolutely determined to learn very little from it. And especially when we're watching these protests in our street, where you're looking at them going, it seems like all it would take is one match lit, like metaphorically speaking, for this to turn really nasty, like we saw on the steps of the Opera House.
We're our own worst enemies in this. You began by asking two questions. Are you allowed to ask, where are these people coming from? And do they share our values? Well, the truth is you can't ask those questions, because to ask where someone is from is to imply that some cultures may have flaws that we don't want, which is true, but cultural relativism says you're not allowed to ask those questions. And the other question you asked is, do they share our values? Well, we're constantly told that our society is illegitimate, that we are interlopers in someone else's land. And so, you know, it's one thing to get immigration right, but if you're going to do what John Howard says and bring people into a culture that they want to be part of, you can't do that when you're constantly deriding your own culture.
Yeah.
So
cultural relativism is a death wish, basically, a death wish for your own culture.
Yeah.
And we should not be afraid to say in the West that our culture is superior. It is a fact.
That's why they want to come here.
It is superior to many other cultures in the world. We are free and we are liberal in many ways. We treat people with tolerance, and that is baked into who we are. I mean, the Australian way of life is the easygoing, everyone has an opportunity, that kind of thing, right? You go to the parts of the world that a lot of people come to Australia from, they've come here because they couldn't get that opportunity over there, because they were persecuted, because they felt unsafe. And we offer that, you know, not refuge if you're not an official refugee, but we offer opportunities here that you can't get anywhere else. And we should not be afraid to applaud ourselves for that fact and make sure the people that come to enjoy those privileges want to be part of that fabric. If you start letting in people, and obviously we have, who were down on the steps of the Opera House and other things we've seen in recent years, who seem to be more interested in events elsewhere, then we're not doing ourselves any favours. As Johnny Howard, as we showed him there, once said, we will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come. And we ought to be discerning in how we do this. And you have to ask the question, 500,000 people coming into the country in one fell swoop, are we being that discerning?
Yeah.